Good morning. We're in part 3 of this 8-part series called Backstory, a study of the book of Ruth. This series is accompanied by a journal that I've called the Ruth Challenge Journal. There's some copies in the foyer right before you come into the sanctuary. These are also available online. If you receive Embrace each week, you can find a link for this journal. This journal gives you some space to take notes on each of the 8 messages in this series. It also gives you a way to track your own progress through the 4 challenges that I'm giving for you each week in this series, very helpfully summarized by the word Ruth. So read the book of Ruth once a week, the entire book. It takes 15 minutes or so. Uncover some of the ways in which what you're reading in the book of Ruth is showing up in your own life. So do some self-reflection, some times of examine. Transcribe, that is write down, handwrite 10 to 11 verses from Ruth each week. And over the course of the series, then you will have written down the entire book of Ruth and noticed some things that you wouldn't have noticed before. And then heed one of the invitations. Each message in this series will have 3 or 4 invitations, some ways that you might put it into practice. And so just pick one of those at the end of each message and lean into that during the week. One of the major themes in the book of Ruth is helpfully summarized by a new book called Everything Sad is Untrue. The author's name is Daniel Nairi. And it's an autobiographical book about his own family's journey. This is one way of summarizing the book. Daniel lived in a beautiful house in Iran with his father, mother, and sister. His mother is a doctor. His father also provided well for their children. The family was held in very high regard. They had happiness. They had very few troubles. And then things turned when a series of events led Daniel's mother to convert from Islam to Christianity. And then she was targeted by authorities. Since the penalty for conversion was death, Daniel, his mother, and his sister fled Iran with the father remaining in Iran. And after a painful period as refugees without any home at all, this fractured family ends up in Oklahoma, where they contend with poverty, domestic abuse, and the challenge of being culturally Persian while in the United States. It's a really fascinating true story that explores this family's shift from one community, friends and family in Iran, to another community, a community of strangers in Edmond, Oklahoma. And it's also a story that explores a faith transition, as especially the mom moves from a life that was focused mostly on Islam to a life that becomes focused on the Christian faith. And in many ways, that really captures what the book of Ruth is all about. The book of Ruth speaks to these times when we exit one community, social network group of people, and then enter another community group of people. And it also speaks to these times when we might experience a shift in our own faith perspective. And we leave one faith perspective behind and we enter into a different kind of faith perspective. We've seen this a bit already as we've been exploring the book of Ruth. The book sort of opens with both of these transitions taking place. And so we watch as Naomi, along with her family, leave Judah because of a famine. They leave their friends, perhaps extended family, lots of people that they've known perhaps all of their lives, and they move to the nation of Moab, a place filled with people that they do not know. And in this transition, they also experience probably some kind of faith transition as well. At least they're leaving a place, Judah, where the entire culture revolves around their faith, And then they moved to Moab, a place filled with different gods and a different kind of religion. And then everything moves in reverse, because now Ruth, along with Naomi, leaves Moab, a place that Ruth has known, filled with friends and family that she has known, and moves to Judah, a place filled with strangers and social networks that she's not a part of. And in this transition, she also goes through a faith transition. She leaves her gods, her faith, a culture that revolves around their understanding of faith, and she moves into a very different kind of faith culture oriented around Judaism. Both of these shifts are taking place in the book of Ruth. And what's interesting in the book of Ruth is that while there are probably a lot of different things that might prompt a change for us in terms of community or even a change in terms of our faith perspective, what compels Ruth to make these changes in her life is her devotion to Naomi. It's this relationship and the sense of devotion to another person that prompts this change in community and in faith perspective. And so we look again at the sense of devotion between Ruth and Naomi. They lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw she was determined to go with her, she said, "No more." What an interesting conversation here between Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. Because the one daughter-in-law, Orpah, comments on these two areas of her life. And in spite of her relationship with Naomi, she decides to return to her people, her community, to keep that social network in place. And she decides to return to her gods, to hold on to the faith perspective that she's had perhaps all of her life. But Ruth is very different. Because of Ruth's deep relationship with Naomi, she decides to do the opposite. And she says, "Your people will be my people. I'll leave this community and embrace a different community." And she says, "Your God will be my God. I'll leave this faith perspective and embrace a different faith perspective." And what's interesting here is this word used to describe how Ruth postured herself toward Naomi. She clung to her, our narrator tells us. That's the same word used back in Genesis to describe the way that marital partners would be toward one another. They would cling toward one another. That's how intensely Ruth feels toward Naomi. That's the strength of the bond that she has with Naomi. Ruth experienced something from Naomi. And I think Ruth experienced something for Naomi that compelled her to endure two very significant transitions in her life. One social, one religious. Leaving a community for another, leaving a faith transition for another. And again, there may be other things that trigger this in our own lives, but I think upon reflection, we'll find that it often is a relationship with a person that leads to the same things in our own lives. Sometimes we see this very same transition happen between partners in a marriage. That is, a partner in a marriage might leave one community for another, out of devotion for their partner. Or a partner in a marriage relationship might actually experience a change in faith perspective because of their partner. You know, there have been several occasions in which Kendra has undergone a change in community out of devotion for me. We met married in college, and about halfway through college, I discerned that God was calling me to go into congregational ministry. And so in order to do that, I would have to go to seminary. And out of devotion to me, Kendra left Las Cruces, where her mom and dad lived, her brother lived, her aunts and uncles and cousins lived, and friends she'd had for many years, and moved with me to a new city, in a new state, where we knew virtually nobody. And sometimes you see that in marriage relationships, where purely out of devotion for a partner, the other partner will endure a change in community. We've also seen this when it comes to faith perspectives, and perhaps you will as well. I think of a couple named Bruce and Donna. Kendra and I were involved as college students in a campus ministry in Las Cruces. Bruce and Donna were also involved in this campus ministry. Bruce had grown up in a Christian home, but for various reasons, I suppose, he had become an atheist, or at least a very strong agnostic. Donna had grown up in a Christian home and remained very devout in her Christian faith. And at some point, Bruce and Donna became friends and then became romantically involved, and eventually they too married. And at least as I think about their relationship, one of the things that I see is the way that it was part of the way that Bruce eventually came back to his Christian faith. Because while we were students in that campus ministry, Bruce sort of left behind his atheism, or at least his agnosticism, and returned wholeheartedly to the Christian faith. And I think in part it was due to his relationship with Donna. That sense of devotion that he began to feel towards her was part of the way in which he began to be more and more open to the faith that God had planted in his life when he was just a child. Sometimes we see these same two shifts from the book of Ruth in families where a child comes out. I've led a number of cohorts for parents of LGBTQ plus children. And one of the things that I've seen again and again in those families is that when a child comes out, it often prompts for the parents a reinvestigation of what the Bible does or does not say about the LGBTQ plus community. And sometimes these are parents who have a pretty traditional, sometimes a rigid view of what the Bible does and does not say about the LGBTQ community. But because of their devotion to their child, they began to reinvestigate that. And often I've seen parents shift in their own faith perspective around that very issue and adopt a perspective that's much more open and much more accepting than it was before. All of that prompted by their devotion to their child. And I think right there it's important for us to stop and to just say this out loud. Just because you experience a transition of some in your own faith, not necessarily leaving the Christian faith, but a change in what you believe about a certain topic. And just because that transition is triggered by your relationship with another person doesn't make that transition invalid, doesn't make that shift meaningless. All that says is that God used that relationship. God used your devotion for that person, a spouse, a child, a friend, someone that you respect. That's what God used to open you up to re-examining this topic, this issue, this perspective. So don't discount that when it happens in your life, because if it hasn't yet, it will. And don't discount it when you see it in the lives of other people. That's often how God brings about changes in faith perspective. The other side of this I've also seen in families of kids who do come out. They'll often experience a change in community as well. Sometimes this is voluntary, sometimes it's not voluntary. I could tell you specific stories of families whose own faith communities rejected them once their child came out. And a change in community was forced upon them. Whether it's voluntary or involuntary, often the result is they wind up in a community that's far healthier for them and for their family. And sometimes we see this mirrored just in general with the way that our own positive or negative experiences with a significant person in our life begins to trigger changes like these in our lives. All the way back in 1923, an author named Philip Cabot wrote a piece for The Atlantic called The Conversion of a Sinner. Not necessarily a piece you would expect to find in a magazine like The Atlantic. But in that piece, he described some of the things that led to his own religious conversion. And what began it, Philip said, was his relationship with a good friend at work. And he described this friend. They interacted often in the office. They would often travel together for business. And they both had a very similar perspective when it came to work. These were two guys who were all or nothing. They were all in. They were all work. Work was their top priority at life. And so they were both successful. They were both wealthy. They were both highly regarded in their fields. And they loved to go on these trips together because they shared that value. But Philip wrote that one morning while they were traveling on a business trip together, he suddenly saw this mask fall from his friend's face. The mask of the happy, successful, thriving, fulfilled business person. And he said that morning as he looked at his friend, his friend's eyes were dark, they were lifeless. His friend's face was gaunt, and his friend said something like, "Philip, you know, there was a time when one cup of coffee would keep me going through the entire day at work." And he said, "But now it takes 3 cups of coffee just to get my head above the water." And 3 years later, his friend died. And he was not at the age when you would expect someone to die. And Philip attributed his friend's death to that hurried and harried pace of life. And he said that relationship right there was the beginning of a change in his own life that led to his own religious conversion. It was that experience with someone that was important in his own life that paved the way for this important change in faith perspective. I suspect the same is true for many of us as we reflect on some of the most important changes that have happened in our lives. They've come either because of the negative or the positive experiences that we've had with a very specific person in our life. And the reality is that there are people around us who have or will experience the same because of us. Because of positive or negative experiences they have with us. They will also undergo shifts from one community to another and from one faith perspective to another. It's often our devotion to another person that God uses to lead us into some of the most important actions that we take in life. Faisal Devji is a teacher at Oxford. He wrote an op-ed recently about the religious conversion of Muslims. And he ended that piece by talking about the terrorist attacks in 2016 in Bangladesh. And he noted this moment when members of a group that associated themselves with ISIS stormed a restaurant and held everyone in that restaurant hostage. The members of the terrorist group did not want to kill anybody who was of the Islamic faith. And so they asked the group if there was anybody here who was Muslim, that they could indicate that and they would be released. And so there were a few who indicated that they were indeed Muslim and they were released unharmed. There was a young man and a young woman present in that group. It was later learned that they were both Muslim. But because of their deep devotion to their non-Muslim friends, in that very moment they remained quiet. They didn't raise their hands, they didn't signify their faith. They remained silent. And they died with their non-Muslim friends. It's often our devotion to some of the people in our lives that leads to the most significant actions in our lives. That's one of the themes that we see playing out here in the book of Ruth. Our devotions to others may prompt some of the most important actions that we take in our lives. I'm trying to end each message with a series of invitations tied to what I'm talking about here, some specific ways that you might live this out. Here are 4. Let me encourage you to just pick one of these this week. 1, identify a person who influenced your own entrance into a helpful community or a healthier faith perspective. And this week, write them a note of thanks. Or 2, consider a way you could help empower someone to experience genuine community or deeper faith. Or 3, consider if it's time for you to exit a community or a faith perspective, or enter into a new community or a new faith perspective. And 4th, what costly action might your devotion to a person in your life be inviting you to take? Let's just pause right here for a few seconds and reflect on that.